The drums beat for 3 days after the news arrived. Not for celebration, not for ceremony, but for mourning. The rhythm was slow and deep, like a heartbeat pulled from the ribs of the earth, and it echoed through the village of Athondo like smoke through a house. Women wailed. Children clung to their mothers. Men walked with their heads low. The war had taken many sons, but it was the name Duma that silenced the air when spoken aloud. They said he died facing east, where the sun rises, where his ancestors could see his face. They said he did not fall until he had taken 3 men with him. They said his blood soaked the ground and fed the soil, and that his bones were burned in a sacred pyre by warriors who honored his courage. But Nala did not weep. She did not kneel or beat her chest like the other widows. She did not smear her face with ash or let the mourners cut her hair. She stood at the edge of the crowd, eyes dry, arms folded, mouth closed as the drumbeat folded into silence. When they placed a bowl of black water at her doorstep, a ritual to cleanse the dead from the living, she tipped it into the sand. They whispered. Of course they whispered. It's shock, said one. Her grief is hidden, said another. She'll break soon. But Nala did not break. Each evening, just as the last bird stilled and the fireflies rose like spirits from the grass, she placed a stool by her door and sat. She did not sow or grind maize or sing to herself. She simply waited. Eyes on the dark path that led between the huts and out into the woods, her back straight, her face expressionless. As though she could see something the rest of them could not. On the first night, her mother came to sit beside her, offering silence as comfort. Nala did not speak and neither did she. When the night grew thick and the insects loud, her mother finally said, "He is gone, my child." Nala turned to her. "No," she said simply. "He isn't." The second night, the elder from the shrine visited. He brought a carved bowl of incense and a string of bones to toss. He knelt before her and cast the bones onto the earth. They clattered once then lay still. "You must mourn him," he said gently, "so his spirit can rest." Nala looked down at the bones, at the way they had arranged themselves into a broken circle. "He is not restless," she said. "He is on his way." The third night the children came. Curious, half afraid, they sat across the path and watched her from the shadows. One little boy crept forward and placed a flower at her feet, a small red bloom that only grew near the river. She did not thank him, but she did not move it either. The fourth night the wind changed. It blew from the east, where Duma had gone, carrying with it a strange scent, not decay, not smoke, not rain. Something in between. Something old. On the fifth night the dogs howled long before the moon rose. One by one they fell silent, their ears pinned, their noses pressed to the ground. No one spoke of it, but no one slept easily. By the sixth night the village had stopped trying to speak to her. Even the whispers had faded. Let her sit, they said. Let her wait. Let her heart break in its own time. But Nala's heart had not broken. It had hardened into something sharper. Something that listened for sounds the living could not hear. She wore Duma's hunting cloak draped around her shoulders, even though the nights were warm. She braided her hair the way he liked it, threaded with copper wire and river beads. She touched the wedding scar he'd carved into her wrist every time the wind shifted. And still she waited. The seventh night came quietly. There was no wind, no moon. Even the crickets were silent. She sat in her usual place, feet bare, arms resting on her knees. Her hands did not tremble. Then just past midnight she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Dragging slightly. Not from the path this time, but from behind the house. From the side where the trees grew thickest and no one walked. Nala rose without fear. She moved to the door and opened it. The darkness outside was dense as wet cloth, but she stepped through it like fog. The air smelled of iron and fire. And on the ground, just beyond the threshold, were footprints. Large. Bare. Blood-slick. They led to the door as though someone had stood there, waiting, then turned away. Nala knelt and touched one print. The blood was still warm. Still wet. She looked into the night. And for the first time in 7 days she smiled. But not because she had found peace. Because she had been right. She stood slowly and walked barefoot down the path the prince had made into the trees without hesitation. The villagers would wake in the morning and find those prints. They would gasp. They would call the elders. They would shake their heads and say prayers. But Nala would not be in her house. And her stool would be empty. Because the one who never cried had finally risen. Not to grieve, but to follow. The first night after she followed the footprints into the woods, Nala returned. No one saw her come back. One moment the door to her hut was shut, dust on the step, the stool still overturned from where she had left it. The next moment it was open and she was inside, sitting cross-legged on the mat like she'd never left. Her eyes were darker than before. Not red from crying, no one had seen her shed a tear, but as if something behind them had dimmed, like coals cooling under ash. She didn't speak to the neighbor who brought her yams. Didn't thank the child who swept her doorstep. She only sat, waiting, watching, as if the world were not quite finished speaking. And then she began to dream. The first dream came gently. She stood in a field of tall grass, wind brushing her cheeks, the sky purple and too still. Duma walked toward her, slow, sure, the way he always had. His shoulders were broad as ever, his walk proud, but something was wrong. His hands were at his sides, not open, not reaching. She ran to him. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But he took her hand. And she flinched. His skin was like winter water, like stones pulled from deep caves. Cold, sure, unfeeling. She tried to let go, but he held on, gripping tighter until her knuckles ached. Duma, she whispered. Still he said nothing. His lips parted as if to speak, but the only sound was wind, empty and dry. She woke with her hand burning from the cold. The next night the dream returned, only this time it wasn't a dream. She had drifted into uneasy sleep, the sort where shadows flicker even behind closed eyes. Outside, the wind howled softly, pushing at the walls of her hut. The fire had long died. She curled under her wrapper, heart unsettled. Then she heard it. The door creaked. Not open, not fully. Just a soft groan, the kind that happens when someone leans against it, waiting to be let in. She sat up, every nerve pulled tight. And there he was, standing in the doorway. Duma. His body filled the frame like a memory summoned too strongly. He was dressed in the armor he had worn when he left for war, leather torn, breastplate dented, one shoulder strap frayed. His hair was matted with dust and something darker. His skin was pale under the moonlight, not pale like sickness but pale like absence, like everything warm had been drained out. His eyes were hollow. Not empty, but hollow. As if they looked out from someplace far beneath the surface. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Nala did not scream. She rose from her mat, slowly, as if moving too quickly might shatter the moment. Her breath caught in her throat, but she stepped forward. Duma, she said, voice barely above a breath. Still he did not answer. He only lifted his hand and beckoned. She followed him to the mat, her feet numb. He lay beside her, as he once had every night before the war, facing her, his breath silent but steady. She studied his face, the scar beneath his left eye, the nick in his jaw where she'd once cut him shaving. All of it was there, but dimmed, like looking at him through still water. His lips moved. Her name came out. Not loud, not hoarse, just wrong. Like someone speaking her name for the first time, guessing at its shape. She reached for his hand, trembling. It was cold again, colder than the night before, colder than the river in the deepest part of dry season. I waited, she said. I know, he said. And that was all. They lay together, unmoving, her head on his shoulder, the way it used to be. But she didn't sleep. She couldn't. His skin never warmed. His body never shifted with breath. And yet he was there. She felt him. Felt his fingers brush her back. Felt his chin rest atop her head. And still, no tears. When the rooster crowed, she blinked. The first light of morning had crept under the door, golden and thin. She sat up. And he was gone. No footsteps. No breath of air. Just the mat rumpled. And the blood. It soaked through the reed mat beneath her, wet and thick. Her wrapper clung to her legs, dark and sticky with it. But her body bore no wounds. Her skin was whole. Her palms, her arms, her back, untouched. The blood wasn't hers. And it hadn't come from any wound she could see. It had just appeared. From the place he had lain. From him. She stood, swaying, the scent rising with her. Iron, rust, something ancient. She didn't scream. She didn't wash. She sat again on her stool outside the door as the village stirred awake. When a woman passing by saw the blood and gasped, Nala didn't flinch. He came, she said simply. The woman stepped back, clutching her chest. You're cursed. Nala looked out at the path. No, she whispered. I'm remembered. And behind her, inside the house, the blood on the mat darkened to black. And then vanished. The goats were the first to suffer. On the morning after the blood-soaked mat, one was found with its throat torn open near the eastern fence. No drag marks, no paw prints, no sounds in the night. The herdsman swore he had tied it with 2 ropes and checked twice before dawn. He stumbled back into the village wide-eyed, clutching its limp body. Its mouth hung open and its eyes were missing. A bad omen, they muttered. But not one they hadn't seen before. Wild dogs, perhaps. Or a spirit wandering too far. They buried the goat quietly and said no more. But then the second came. And the third. All found in silence. Always near the edge of the village. Always mutilated as though something had torn into them, but not to eat, only to destroy. One had all its legs broken and set at unnatural angles. Another was found skinned, yet there was no blood where it lay. People began walking faster past the fences. Men started carrying machetes again when going to the fields. The women no longer left out yams at night. And through it all Nala remained still. She never left her compound. She did not go to the stream. She did not return to market. Her door stayed shut during the day, but many swore they saw her moving through the compound after dusk. Her shadow on the walls. Her voice, or something like it, humming songs she never sang before. The children knew first. They always know. They would pass her home and fall silent, even the boldest ones. One day little Aji wandered too close to her fence chasing a lizard. He came back pale, silent, clinging to his mother and refusing to speak for 3 days. When he finally opened his mouth he said, "A man is standing in her yard. But he doesn't have eyes." The children no longer played near her side of the village. Then came the night the fire went out. It was the largest hearth in the center of the village, kept alive by the elders for generations. It never died, not even during storms. It was protected with salt, ash, and prayer. But that night, without warning, it dimmed, flickered, and then vanished completely. No smoke, no hiss, just blackness. Elder Kigo cried out first. Not for the fire, but for what he saw in the moment it died, a silhouette at the edge of the flame. Tall, motionless, watching them from the dark. That same night, the storyteller's voice failed her. She had gathered the children to tell them the tale of the wandering widow, a harmless ghost story that made them laugh. But when she opened her mouth to begin, only a croak came. Her throat swelled, her lips cracked, and she collapsed in the sand. They carried her to the healer, who placed a bowl of water beside her. The water turned red. It wasn't until dawn that the elder women gathered and said what everyone was already thinking. Nala. They didn't accuse her outright. Not yet. But eyes lingered. Doors bolted early. No offerings were left near her fence. Her name was spoken only in whispers. It wasn't just fear. It was the weight of her silence. They had expected tears or rage or collapse. Instead, they had a woman who sat still while the world shifted around her. Who welcomed a blood-soaked mat without question. Who dreamed in shadows. Who had once walked into the forest and returned unharmed. If the dead are called back by love, said Elder Mora, they will take more than love in return. She said it not as warning, but as remembrance. Because she had seen it once, long ago when she was a girl, another woman who had refused to mourn. Another man who had died too far away. Another shadow that slipped back across the threshold like smoke with memory. They never come back alone, she said softly. They bring the places they've been. Still no one went to Nala. No one dared confront her. The priest poured libation in secret. The hunters began to sleep with spears at their doors. Mothers drew white chalk symbols on their children's foreheads before bed. But the village grew quieter with each passing day. Voices dropped to murmurs. Songs no longer echoed from courtyards. Drums sat untouched. Even the birds seemed to nest farther away. Only the wind dared speak freely now, and even it carried the scent of rust and dry leaves. Then one morning, 3 goats were found at the shrine. Lined side by side, their hearts missing. No blood. Just empty chests turned toward the east. Nala's door creaked open that day. She stepped out just before dusk. She wore Duma's cloak. Her hair was unbraided. Her feet bare. She didn't speak. She only looked to the east. And in her eyes something watched. Not her grief. Not her rage. But the thing that had answered it. Each night, just after the last ember in the fire died and the wind fell still, Nala heard the soft creak of the doorway. It was never loud. Just enough to wake her heart before it woke her body. Her breath would tighten. The shadows in her hut would lengthen. And then he would appear. Duma. No longer as he had looked in life, no longer as he had even looked in those first terrible nights after his return. The more he came, the less human he seemed. His face was familiar, almost. The scar on his brow. The slight tilt of his nose. The skin of his shoulders browned by sun and scarred by battle. But his mouth, that was where the wrongness lived. It never closed. Not truly. Even when he stopped speaking, even when he was still, his lips remained parted, teeth just barely showing. not in a smile, not in a grimace. Just open. Gaping. As though some last scream had gotten stuck inside him and never quite finished. The first few nights, he sat beside her on the mat and spoke as if he'd never left. He spoke of the red hills where the fighting had begun. The long march, barefoot and blistered. The cold nights where men huddled together like dogs to keep warm. He told her of his brother, Jono, who had taken a spear through the stomach and kept crawling until his hands went limp. Of the smell of burning hair. Of the boy whose tongue caught fire from a curse no one could see. Of how the sky over the battlefield never cleared, not even when the rain poured. Nala listened. She never interrupted. Never turned away. Even when the shadows behind him twisted. Even when his voice carried echoes, as if he were speaking not alone but with others. As if a crowd of broken-throated men whispered with him. And all the while his mouth stayed open. Once she caught herself staring. Not at his face but inside it, into the dark of that mouth. And in that second she could swear she saw movement. Not a tongue. Not breath. But something deeper. Coiling. Shifting. The next night she asked him, "Are you in pain?" He paused for a moment as if confused. Then he said, "No. I remember pain. But now it is only sound." She almost asked what that meant. But her voice caught in her throat. Instead she asked, "Why do you still come?" And he answered, "Because you called." His voice was not angry. Not kind. Just fact. She didn't argue. Because she had. She'd called with silence. With sleepless nights. With the stubborn belief that love alone could bend what death had broken. But now something had bent with her. Something had heard. On the 7th night, Duma came earlier than usual. The sun had only just dropped, and the shadows had not yet swallowed the floor. He did not sit this time. He stood by the door, head tilted as if listening to a sound beyond her hearing. Then he looked at her and his lips barely moved. "Soon," he whispered, "you'll follow?" She froze. "What do you mean?" she asked. He tilted his head again. "Soon," he said again. "You'll follow." And then like smoke he was gone. The room grew cold. Colder than it had ever been. Colder than bone. That night, for the first time, Nala did what she had not done in weeks. She locked the door. Not just the carved wooden bar but with rope, charms, chalk, prayers. She burned camwood and rubbed its ash across the threshold. She placed salt at every corner. She sat in the center of the room, legs crossed, eyes wide open. She did not sleep. She did not blink. And still the blood came. It began as a drop. At first she thought it was sweat. The room had turned hot again. But when it struck her arm it was thick. Sticky. Red. Another drop hit the mat. Then another. And then a slow stream began to trickle from the ceiling. No holes above. No cracks. Just blood, oozing downward from nothing. She scrambled to her feet. Pressed herself against the wall. The blood spread, not fast but steady. It crawled across the mat, along the base of the door, up the legs of her stool. It reached for her ankles. She stepped into the sleeping corner, heart thudding. Then a sound rose behind the door. Breathing. Long, deep. Unnatural. As if someone were standing just outside, pressing their face against the wood. She wanted to scream but the sound died in her throat. A voice whispered through the cracks. "Oh, familiar." "You locked the door," it said. "Why?" It was Duma's voice. And not. She didn't answer. She couldn't. "You called me," it whispered. "And I came." The blood began to bubble near the hearth. It hissed and steamed. Nala clutched the charm her mother had once given her, dried roots knotted in twine. She hadn't believed in its power for years. Now she begged it to work. The voice sighed. "I remember the battle," it said. "I remember the screams. But they stopped, Nala. And now there is only the sound your love makes. That is louder than pain." A silence fell. Then the mouth spoke again. "You will follow. Not in death. But in memory." And the breathing stopped. The blood froze in place, mid-drip, mid-crawl. Then receded. Like a wave pulling back into a sea no one could see. When morning came the mat was clean. The air was still. And Nala's voice was gone. Not her body. Not her sight. Just her voice. She opened her mouth to speak, to pray, and found only silence. As if something had reached in during the night and stolen her sound. She placed her hands over her mouth. And in the mirror shard that hung by her bed, she saw her reflection. Eyes hollow. Mouth open. The silence that followed the blood was heavier than any scream. It draped itself over Nala's hut like wet cloth, pressing into the walls, choking the fire, muting the birds. And though she could no longer speak, her eyes told the truth. she was unraveling. Not with madness but with clarity too sharp to carry. Her grandmother came on the third day. Old Mama Esh walked the path from her homestead slowly, leaning on her polished stick carved from lightning-struck wood. She wore a wrapper of deep blue and gold, and her silver hair was braided down her back like a rope of memory. When she arrived she said nothing. Only looked at her granddaughter, at the empty mat, at the way Nala's mouth stayed half open now, like the man who haunted her, and nodded once as if confirming something she already knew. "They never listen," she muttered to the wind. "But they never stop calling either." She did not wait to be invited in. She entered the hut, tossed camwood powder into the fire pit, and stirred it with the tip of her staff. A thin red smoke rose. It spiraled toward the ceiling, curled, and vanished through invisible cracks. Then she turned to Nala. "You are not cursed," she said firmly. "You are seen. That is worse." Nala wanted to ask what that meant. Wanted to beg for help. But her voice was still missing, stolen or hidden or silenced by the very thing she had once loved. Mama Esh placed a hand over Nala's heart. "You are not the first. You will not be the last. But if you are to survive this, we must feed the silence something heavier than grief." She left that night and returned before the moon rose, carrying a gourd wrapped in cloth, a bundle of dried herbs and a small wooden bowl. Behind her, 2 young boys dragged a clay pot half the size of a drum. Nala didn't ask what was inside, she didn't have to. It was time for the offering of bones. Long ago, when warriors died far from home, their families performed the ritual to bring rest to their spirits. It was a dangerous rite, one done only if the dead could not return, and only if they refused to stay away. The bones in the pot had been Duma's once, pieces sent back from the battlefield. A finger, a tooth, the cracked remains of his right rib. Relics, symbols, echoes. Esh dug a pit near the tree behind Nala's hut, not too deep but wide. The earth was dry, as if even the ground hesitated to open again. The boys stood back silent. Esh placed each bone inside carefully, whispering the names of Duma's mothers before him. She sprinkled black salt and powdered charcoal over the remains, then dropped 3 hot coals from a nearby fire into the pit. They hissed, spat, and were still. Then she whispered a word Nala had never heard before. And the ground shivered. Esh covered the bones with earth, patted it down, and drew a chalk circle around the burial. In the 4 directions she placed tokens: a dried yam, a coil of copper wire, a feather from a hawk, and a piece of obsidian. When she was done she turned to Nala. "For tonight you will sleep," she said. And Nala did. For the first time in weeks she dreamed of nothing. No footsteps. No whispering voices. No blood. No Duma. Just silence. When she woke she cried. Not because she was afraid, but because peace felt foreign now. She wept silently until the sun touched her floor. Mama Esh watched her from the stool, eyes closed, face still. Then as the day darkened something changed. It began with a smell. Rot. And smoke. And burnt feathers. Then came the humming. Not from outside. From beneath. The ground behind her hut, where the bones had been buried, vibrated softly. Mama Esh's eyes snapped open. She rose slowly, gripping her staff tighter. "No," she muttered. "Not yet." She stepped outside. The moon was high now, full, silver, sharp. The chalk circle had cracked. The obsidian had shattered. And from the pit, a single bone had risen. It stood upright, balanced impossibly on its end, gleaming with wetness. Then another followed, the rib. But it was no longer clean. It was splintered, twisted. The feather was gone. And then came the sound. A voice. Not Duma's. Not entirely. It was deeper. Thicker. As if many throats were speaking at once. Why bury what was called back? Mama Esh stepped back. "Go," she said quietly. "Return to the earth. She never asked you to stay." But the earth split wider. The soil trembled. And from it, the remaining bones erupted, not tossed but thrown, like something had rejected the grave itself. They landed in the dirt, twitching. And from the shadows near the fence, Duma stepped forward. His armor was darker now, smeared with ash and something slick. His hands hung at his sides, stained. His mouth, still open, stretched wider than before. But it was his eyes that changed. They were no longer hollow. They were full. Of others. Eyes behind eyes. Layered. Watching. Mama Esh drew her staff and slammed it into the ground. The earth flinched. "You were not meant to stay," she hissed. Duma's voice came, but not alone. "Then why call us?" "Not me." Esh turned to Nala, who stood frozen in the doorway. "This is no longer just him," she said. The voices laughed. She loved well, they said in unison. So well it echoed. And then Duma, or the thing that wore him, began to walk. Not toward Esh, but toward Nala. Mama Esh shouted a word loud, hard, a name not spoken in years. A wind burst through the yard. It shoved Duma back 2 steps. But he laughed again. And when he opened his mouth wider they could both see, the mouths inside. So many. All open. All whispering. Nala stumbled back into the hut, fingers trembling. She grabbed the only thing she could, the necklace Duma had given her before he left. Copper. Etched with his name. She held it up. His eyes flickered. One voice, his true voice, slipped through. Nala. Just that. And then the others drowned him out. Esh pushed the girl behind her. Get inside. Salt the door. Burn the last gourd. But, Nala tried to say, forgetting she couldn't speak. No sound came. Only tears now. Real ones. Esh lit the last gourd and hurled it into the yard. It exploded with blue flame. The bones on the ground shrieked, not in sound but vibration. The thing that was Duma turned sharply, vanished into the trees. The flames died fast. But the silence remained. Esh leaned heavily on her staff. The bones won't hold him, she said. Not anymore. Nala touched her chest. Then pointed to the forest. Esh nodded grimly. You called him. But something else came too. Now it knows the way back. Nala looked at the cracked earth where the rib had once rested. And she understood. It would not be sealed again. Not until the voice inside the voice, the thing behind her husband's mouth, found what it came for. The armor weighed more than it should have. Not because of the iron or the rust but because it remembered. Each link of chain, each dented plate, each blood-blackened strap seemed to hold echoes, screams trapped like insects in amber. Nala could feel them as she lifted it from where it had been hidden, wrapped in goat hide and buried beneath the floorboards. Her fingers trembled. The metal was cold, colder than the wind outside, colder even than Duma's touch. She hadn't told Mama Esh what she planned to do. The old woman had left at dawn, muttering about finding herbs strong enough to quiet the voices that no longer let her sleep. Nala knew there wasn't a leaf in the world that could silence what she had brought back. She wrapped the armor in white cloth and tied it with salt-soaked rope. Then she stepped barefoot onto the red path, the morning still and gray, the village quiet behind her. No one saw her go. The sacred river curled like a snake at the edge of the forest, winding through rocks carved by centuries of worship and offering. The people of the village did not drink from it, only prayed by it. It was where names were whispered into newborn ears. Where oaths were made and unfaithful lovers cursed. It was said to recognize truth, and to refuse what did not belong. She reached its bank just as the mist began to lift. The current was slow, dark, deep. For a moment, Nala hesitated. Then she knelt by the edge and untied the rope. The armor inside the cloth shuddered. Not visibly but in her bones. She heard something faint, like breath on metal. Like teeth on stone. She picked up the breastplate first, holding it by the edges so her skin did not touch the dried blood that stained it. One step forward. Then another. The water rippled. Nala inhaled and lowered the armor into the river. For a heartbeat all was still. Then the water hissed. Steam exploded around her. Boiling bubbles raced up her arms. The armor jerked in her grip like a living thing. She dropped it with a cry that had no voice. The metal sank, then shot back up as if the river itself had spit it out. Fish floated to the surface, bellies white, mouths gaping. A soft wailing filled the air, not from the trees, not from any bird. From the water. The river screamed. Nala stumbled back, burned palms pressed to her dress. The water boiled in rings around where the armor bobbed. When she reached for it again, the river surged upward, a wave that struck her chest and threw her backward onto the shore. She landed hard, breath gone, eyes wide. The armor clattered beside her, untouched by water. Still cold. Still humming. She dragged it back with shaking hands, rewrapping it. Her mind a storm. Her heart a drum. That night she did not sleep. She sat near her fire with the armor beside her, hidden beneath cloth but still present, like a corpse under thin sheets. The hut was too quiet. Even the insects had gone. And then she heard the wet steps. Dripping. Deliberate. Outside her door. 1, 2, 3. Pause. Then a hand, not knocking, not pounding, just resting against the wood. She stood slowly. Her body knew before her mind did. She opened the door. And there he was. Soaked. Snarling. Steam rising off his skin like breath from a beast. His eyes, if they were still his, burned red beneath dripping lashes. Water poured from his mouth, leaking down his chest like blood. "You would unmake me?" he hissed. His voice was layered now. Not a crowd as before, but something deeper. Singular. Hollow and vast. Like the voice of a cave, of something ancient forced through human shape. Nala stepped back. She wanted to say no. Wanted to scream that she didn't understand. That she only wanted the blood gone. That she only wanted to save him. But there was no voice left in her throat. So she lifted the armor instead. Showed it to him like an offering. Or a challenge. He looked at it. And for the first time he growled. "You think what I wore made me what I am?" he said, stepping inside. "You think washing away the blood will wash away me?" The fire dimmed. The hut grew cold again. He moved closer. His skin dripped river water. And his feet left no footprints. "You called me with grief," he said. "You tried to dismiss me with guilt." He leaned in. His breath was warm. But it smelled of iron. "You cannot love the dead and expect them to stay buried." Then with slow fingers he touched the armor. The metal hissed. The fire went out. In the dark his eyes glowed, not with light but with memory. All the wars he'd seen. All the screams he'd swallowed. All the pieces of himself he'd left behind. And all the others who had followed him back. Nala fell to her knees. Tears rolled down her cheeks. But she did not beg. She did not run. She placed the armor between them. And with shaking hands, drew a line of chalk across the ground. The same pattern her grandmother had once shown her. Duma watched. For a moment he did not speak. Then he bent down. Placed his wet, ruined hand on the line. It sizzled. Smoke curled. And for a second, just a second, his mouth began to close. Not all the way. But enough. Enough to remind her of the man who had once said her name like a promise. He turned without another word and stepped into the night. The chalk line smoldered. The armor lay still. And Nala, breathless and burned, knew she had not unmade him. She had only awakened what had always been waiting underneath. The wind that night came not from the trees but from Duma's mouth. Nala sat beside the dim fire, watching him sleep, or whatever version of sleep the dead could perform. His chest did not rise or fall. His eyes, when shut, fluttered too fast like something on the inside was knocking against the lids. And then he said it. Not her name. Not anything close to Nala. "Ndidi," he whispered. A hush fell across the room. Her body stiffened as though the sound of that name carried weight, not on her ears but in her bones. The name rolled like a sigh but it echoed like a drumbeat. It didn't belong in this house. It didn't belong on his lips. She leaned closer. Again his voice came, softer but thick with longing. "Ndidi." Not a cry. A call. Nala sat back slowly. She didn't recognize the name. Not from childhood stories, not from village whispers. But her heart, it did. It recoiled, cold and furious, as if some part of her soul had been tricked into answering a door that wasn't hers to open. The next morning she went to Mama Esh, whose eyes had grown darker each day, whose bones creaked now like doors half ajar. Nala could not speak but she could write. On a piece of palm parchment she scrawled the name. Mama Esh looked at it once and hissed. She snatched the paper and threw it into the fire. "Where did you hear this?" she asked. Nala pointed back toward the direction of her hut. Her eyes pleaded for answers. Mama Esh's lips tightened. He should not have spoken her name. Then the old woman sat down and poured a bowl of river sand, smoothing its surface with her fingers. "In the war," she said slowly, "there were not only men. There were vows made in terror. There were pacts sealed not with ink but with bone. I warned them. Your Duma, he went with others into the Shadow Valley beyond our lands, to face something none of us could name. They were desperate. They made a bond. One that promised no man would die alone." She traced a line in the sand. "They called on a spirit. A thing buried in the mountain stones. Its name was Ndidi. They offered her blood, not just enemy blood, their own. In return she gave them protection, but she also demanded a place to dwell. One place. One body. After death." Mama Esh looked up, eyes wide with something close to pity. "He chose himself." Nala's hands shook. She pointed again to the fire. To her chest. "She's here now," Esh whispered. "Inside your home. Inside your husband. She rides him like a forgotten song rides the wind. That name he called, it wasn't yours. It never was. And now she's looking through your eyes to find the rest of her." The old woman reached into her pouch and pulled out a small bead carved from onyx. She handed it to Nala. "This won't stop her. But it will make her speak." That night, Nala placed the bead beneath Duma's head. At first nothing changed. But then his mouth opened. And another voice came out. Not Duma's. Not even male. It was a woman's voice, deep, velvety and filled with something too old to be rage. I watched them burn, the voice said. I held their bones in my lap. I took their blood into me and I kept them warm in the cold soil. I am Didi. Nala backed away. The body of her husband did not move. Only the voice filled the room. He gave me a place, she said. He invited me in. But your home is warmer. Your grief is louder. Pause. I could stay here. Then silence. Duma's chest did not rise. His eyes stayed closed. But Nala, standing in the corner of her hut, felt as though every wall had turned to skin, listening, breathing, smiling without a face. She now lived with more than memory. She lived with a name that was not hers. The old priest came from beyond the hills, summoned in silence. No bell was rung, no message sent. And yet, on the morning when the birds forgot to sing and even Mama Esh refused to speak above a whisper, he appeared, barefoot, with a staff made of bone and a necklace of teeth that clacked with every step. He didn't ask to be welcomed. He simply walked into Nala's compound, looked once at the hut and nodded. They should never have made that pact, he said, though no one had told him. His name was Father Yukono. He spoke only to the fire and the gods who still listened to men. In his satchel, he carried a talisman, a coil of black iron wrapped with strands of hair and feathers, bound in the skin of an unborn goat. It smelled of smoke and soil and something sharper, something that stung the eyes. This will hold him, he said, handing it to Nala, but only if he wants to be held. She could not ask the questions crowding her throat. Her voice had not returned. So she placed her hands on her heart, then on her belly, then pointed to the doorway where Duma always stood when dusk bled into night. The priest understood. That evening, Nala laid the talisman just inside the threshold. Its presence made the hut hum with tension, the air heavy with unseen weight. The flames in her hearth burned steady, unmoving, as if afraid to dance. For the first time in many nights, Duma did not appear. No wet footprints. No hiss of his breath against the reed walls. No whisper of other voices pushing through his lips. She slept. But sleep, for Nala, had long ago ceased to mean peace. The dream came thick and fast, not like mist but like a hand over her mouth. She stood in a wide plain of black sand, windless and endless. The sky above was wrong, a deep violet filled with stars that blinked too fast. And in the middle of it Duma knelt. His armor was gone. His face was his own again, eyes dark and full of sorrow, lips trembling. But around his neck was a chain. It dug deep into his skin, wrapping his shoulders, sinking into his chest. Every time he breathed, it rattled softly, mournfully, like anklets on a widow. He saw her. And he wept. I didn't want to come back, he said, voice hoarse and human. I begged them to let me stay buried. Nala moved to him. Her limbs were slow, as though air had thickened into water. She reached for his face, but he recoiled as if her fingers burned. I'm not alone in here, he whispered. They came with me. She came with me. And then he lowered his head. With a guttural sound he opened his mouth wide, too wide, and bit the chain. What? Twice. It snapped like dry bone. The sound echoed across the black sand. The stars blinked out. And a wind rose. A cruel wind. A voice hidden inside it. Nala woke gasping. The fire was out. The talisman lay shattered on the ground. Twisted. Melted. She crawled toward it, heart slamming against her ribs. Outside the hut the air was still. But in the doorway fresh footprints glistened in blood. The night came too slowly. All day the sky sat over the village like a sealed pot, heavy with a heat that refused to break. Clouds gathered at the edges but never cried. The birds did not fly. The goats refused to eat. Even the air seemed to wait, expectant and afraid. Nala moved with purpose. She borrowed candles from every home in the village. Even those who had grown cold toward her, who wouldn't speak or meet her gaze, still handed them over wordlessly, as if some part of them knew that this was no longer just her burden. She lit the first wick at dusk, then another and another, until her entire compound was a sea of trembling flames. Hundreds, flickering like tiny souls, lined her doorway, her windows, the footpath to her home. It was the light of refusal. Inside her hut, she sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, a line of salt across her threshold, ash smeared beneath her eyes. The talisman was long broken. Her voice had not returned. But she had something else now. Oh, she would not answer tonight. Not again. When the moon rose she did not look at it. She stared only at the door. The hut was so bright with candlelight that her own shadow danced on the far wall, swaying like a woman preparing for burial. It began the way it always did. The first footstep, too wet, too slow, pressed into the dirt outside. Then the second. Then the breath against the door. But Nala did not move. Nala, Duma's voice came. Ragged, cracked. She closed her eyes. His hand pressed to the door. "I've come," he whispered. "As I always do. Open the door." She said nothing. He paused. Then the voice sharpened. "Please." Still nothing. "Don't turn away from me." She gripped the edge of her seat, her nails digging into the wood. "You call me back," he said. "You let me in. And now you hide." His footsteps paced the threshold. "You asked for me." The voice cracked, desperate. "I bled for you." But she remained still. And then his voice shifted. Grew louder. More layered. More hollow. "I said your name." The candles near the doorway shuddered. Some blew out. She kept her eyes on the floor. Then came the scream, not from him but from something else inside him. Something deeper. Older. "She's mine now," it said. The air turned cold. All at once, half the flames in her hut went out, plunging the walls into a jagged dark. Her shadow vanished. But Nala didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't speak. Outside the wind wailed, or maybe it was Duma. Maybe it was what remained of him, fighting inside the husk he no longer fully owned. "I didn't want this," he cried, softer again. "I was afraid. I was bleeding and I thought, if I made the pact I'd come home." Silence. I didn't know she would follow. Still Nala said nothing. The candles behind her began to reignite on their own, one by one, steady, clean, as if her silence had summoned a power stronger than any prayer. Then the voice returned. Not Duma. The other one. The woman. The spirit. The thing wearing him. "She chose me when she chose you," it said. She opened the door. Then the voice dropped to a hiss. "She'll answer again." And just like that, the air cleared. No more footsteps. No more breath. No more voice. Just the trembling of flames, the soft creak of the night, and the sound of Nala's quiet heart, still beating. She had not answered. Not this time. And something had learned that she could not be commanded anymore. No one saw her leave. No one saw her stay. One morning the villagers woke to silence, heavier than usual, deeper than morning. Nala's door was shut, bolted from the inside. The windows were covered with cloth too thick for light, too dark for shadow. And though her garden had withered, one flower, a white hibiscus strangely new, bloomed right by the doorstep. They waited a day then too. No smoke rose from her hearth. No footprints marked her threshold. But no one dared open the door. Not after the night the candles all burned upside down. Not after the night half the goats in the village were found weeping blood from their eyes. So they let the house be. Still. Quiet. Wrong. Children began to whisper it was cursed. That if you pressed your ear against the door too long, you'd hear someone breathing from the other side. Not quite man, not quite beast. Some said it sounded like sobbing. Others said it laughed. But they all agreed, someone was still inside. The first child to knock was a boy named Keen. 10 years old, with a lion's heart and a foolish dare. His brothers had promised him a coin if he tapped once on the wood and waited. He went at dusk, just as the sun sank and the sky turned rust red. He placed his hand on the door. It felt cold. Too cold for a door left in the sun. He knocked. What? The sound echoed like a drum in a tomb. Keen waited, heart thudding in his throat. Then, from behind the door, a man's voice, low, gentle, pained. "Nala?" Keen screamed and ran until his feet bled. He never went near the house again. The coin was never claimed. Years passed. The roof never caved in. The wood never rotted. Sometimes blood would streak the lintel, just 3 drops, always fresh, never old. They never dried. And no one dared wipe them away. One woman tried once, early on, whispering prayers with every rub of her cloth. Her hands broke out in boils the next morning. She never spoke again. So the house became part of the landscape. Avoided. Feared. Unspoken. Until the anniversary. Each year, on the same night the war had ended, when the last horn had sounded and the soldiers' blood turned cool in the soil, someone in the village would hear it. A whisper. Not loud, not demanding. Just searching. Nala. Sometimes it came from inside the house. Sometimes from behind someone's ear. Sometimes from the trees near the river. Always the same word. Always the same voice. Those who heard it swore it was filled with sorrow, regret, and something older, something like hunger but deeper. A few brave ones, desperate or grieving or broken, would return to the house hoping to find meaning. One left a flower. Another, a note. Come back if you still remember me. None of them ever stayed longer than a minute, because by then they'd all heard the second voice. The one that came after the whisper. The one that said, not with longing but with ownership, "She's mine." And the door would shiver. Just slightly. As if someone inside was waiting for the right moment to open it. But it never did. It remained shut. Year after year. The house that no one opened. And somewhere inside, where the dust never settled and the air never breathed, two names circled each other like smoke. One always called. The other always claimed.